Hey guys, Chris from the Ultimate Recycler. I've spent all day in the shed. I've been working on a clock repair video, which you've probably seen. I've had troubles with the internet. The computers are playing up. I've got editing software issues. It's been one of those days. I'm going a little crazy. Maybe I've had too much coffee. Before I go inside tonight, it's about 8 p.m. I'm going to start the next video and we're going to try and get further into the corner of the shed. Wish me luck. Now, last time we ventured over here, I think that chainsaw nearly bit me. I got a bit tangled up in some wires. It's pretty difficult to get across there, and I do keep mentioning that I need to get to my sandblaster over there because I've got some projects awaiting the use of that. So let's tackle something else, and right in front of me is a big bucket of scrap metal, assorted stuff. It would have come from the backyard of the shop, and it's something I just didn't get around to dealing with. Let's lift that up on the bench and go through it and see if we can sort something out. And then, well, we're half a step closer, aren't we? All right, let's get this stuff up on the bench. There's a mixer from a sink and a bit of cast iron stuff. And we'll get the bucket up. Oh, it's got some weight in it. But luckily my shoulder's really improved. So all good there, no need to panic. Now, I'm not sure where this video is going to go. I just know that when I start videos for you guys, it keeps me motivated to finish dealing with stuff and not just shove it under another bench. So let's go through it. I guess the challenge, well, the interesting thing out of this bucket, if it is all just scrap metal, is how many dollars worth of brass are we going to get out of this one bucket? And I will go through probably and show you a few ways I like to separate my brass from other steel and impurities. A couple of tricks I've shown you before, but we'll go through it again in case you've just found this video and you haven't been on my channel before. So a lot of these are plumbing fittings. The taps are just about always brass. Sometimes they're chrome plated, like this shower outlet. It's going to be chrome plated brass. Sometimes you can have chrome plated copper, but that's probably going to be all brass. We'll check it with a file in a minute. You can actually see the platings coming off there if we get a focus on that. So that's clearly brass underneath the plating. And the scrapyards will accept plated brass as clean brass. There's no issues there, as long as you don't have any steel or other metals or even lots of plastic. You don't want to have too many impurities, but plating's okay. So that sort of tap I would normally sell through the shop. I would probably get $10 for an old tap like that. But it's badly chewed on the side here. The fitting there is completely rusted on. Probably best to actually run a grinder through that to get it off. And by the time we do that, we're going to cut into the thread. So it's no longer a usable tap. So because brass is paying pretty well, that will go in our brass bin. So we'll clean that up in a minute. That will be an angle grinder job. This one, that's going to be a standard brass tap that I wouldn't bother selling, so that will just go in the brass. We'll get a magnet next. Scrapper's #1 tool. That'll be galvanized water pipe, so that's all steel. The tap is non-magnetic. That end, oh, okay, there's a steel fitting there. I would have actually guessed that was brass, but certainly not. So we can undo that fitting. This should screw out, and I'll give this a thump with a hammer later and show you how I free these up. It's easier to undo them if you can, rather than get out the angle grinder and cut through it. So we'll make a couple of piles. This will be a pile that we'll have to get the shifter onto, or the Stilsons, or some sort of wrench to undo that. And we'll give this a hit with a hammer on the anvil shortly too. So another brass tap here with, it looks like this has been lying in the grass so long that the grass has found its way in through it. I can see it curled up in there. So it will come out with a bit of persuasion. That's pretty well going to be all brass. Got the magnet here. Yeah, sometimes that collar nut can be steel, but that appears to be all brass. We'll check it with a file. So I have a pile. Actually, we'll probably use the grinder to check it because it's actually quicker. If I was out dumpster diving or something, I'd probably have a file with me, but in the shed we can use the angle grinder. So we'll have a pile just to check. We'll have a pile that we'll need to actually cut things with the grinder. and we'll have a pile where we have to undo them. Alright, this one is again brass that end I would suggest, and that's a galvanized fitting, so that will just have to be undone in the vise. This is a quick release coupling, probably from a pump or something, and some of these, that's very light, that's going to be an aluminium, a cast aluminium. It's been aluminium welded, so even though that would be normally classed as domestic aluminium, it could go in with your cast, and it is welded, so that's all good. We would have to get these levers off though. I actually think I don't think they're aluminium. We'll check them with the grinder, but the rivets are steel. So if we put that in like it is, it would go as dirty or irony aluminium, a much lower price. We're probably better to just whip the grinder through those and break those little handles off. And while we've got the grinder going, we'll check what metal that is, because I don't think it's aluminium. It might even be brass. So that's the check with the grinder pile. Where's that gone? Over there. Standard plumbing fittings here. That's been, oh geez, that's been almost ground. I don't know, that's been dragged along a road or something. That's certainly brass. That's brass, and this will be copper. It's a little dirty, a little corroded. You'd probably get away with that in your candy copper, but possibly more number 2 copper. Depends, the yards will let a little bit of this through with nice clean copper, but if you had all of this, it would be probably classed as number 2. But that'll just undo with a spanner. We'd probably have to hacksaw the pipe to get that out. Lots more plumbing fittings, probably a basic brass tap, a steel elbow and a brass fitting in that end. So a spanner for that one. This is a transformer from a fluorescent light or a ballast. Some people pull these apart for the copper. There's copper wire in them, like every transformer. However, these older ones do have some nasty chemicals in them. I forget what they're called. Starts with P, but I can't remember their name. It doesn't matter. I don't think they're worth getting the copper wire out of anyway, but the older ones do have some nasty compounds in them, so you're much better off just selling them with transformers, or most yards will take them as electric motors. Random bits of fittings here. They're going to be brass each end. Obviously the hose clamp is steel. Probably should be able to undo those ones. Oh look, that one's undoing already. So that's clean brass, straight in a brass pile. And we might have to cut these off. Oh, that's got an olive, what they call an olive there, that joins 2 fittings together. So that will come off easily just in the vise when we're using our normal tools to undo things. Oh, here's a nice little tap. So that's just it's a nickel plated tap. It'll be brass. The nut on the back appears to be brass. It's got the handle on it. And I would think for the amount of brass we're going to get out of that, it's fairly small. I think I'll undo that nut so that we can see the thread. I'll need a spanner for that. But I think I'll get better dollars for that tap through the shop as a tap rather than selling it as brass. But we'll put it in our have to undo pile. Alright, there's a lot of brass fittings in this bucket and they're all clean, so that's good. Oh, this is the other part of that quick release fitting, probably, as I said, off a fire pump, maybe a water pump of some sort. That fitting is aluminium. This one's steel. Hopefully it undoes easily. Something like this, if it was at all hard to undo, I wouldn't waste my time, because you're only after a few cents worth of aluminium. It could probably just go in your irony aluminium, but I think that'll undo pretty easily. Some of these fittings I'll actually sell. If it was a brass fitting, I'd consider selling it, but I think that can just go in our aluminium scrap. There's a little piece of just domestic sheet aluminium. That's nice and clean. And this is an early soldering iron. Now, these soldering irons often went on the old pressure Kero torches, or a blowtorch, and that lump there will be solid copper, and the rod is steel, but they are extremely hard to get out. I think they actually poured or moulded or cast the copper over the end of this rod. I've tried to pull them out before. It'd be nice if they just undid, but they're not threaded, and the steel has barbs inside it so that you can't just pull it out. Copper being fairly soft, it's a little hard to cut with the grinder because it tends to bog the grinder down and it throws lots of copper chips everywhere. Probably still the easiest way. There's a fair weight of copper there, and I don't want to just throw it in the normal steel, so we might get the grinder out of that. Alright, I won't waste much more time talking. I'll sort out what's in the bucket. There's a fair amount of it. It's just going to be nice clean brass. So I'll sort it all out, make some piles, and I'll get back to you shortly. So last night I made it to the bottom of the bucket before I went inside. We just got some, almost some garden mulch in the bottom there. I didn't find anything terribly exciting. A lot of good brass, which is pretty cool. It should add up to a fair bit. I found another tap that I think is worth selling as a tap. A few other random bits and pieces we'll go through shortly. We have to clean up some of it and make some decisions. And these two bits were on top, as you probably saw yesterday, so we'll deal with them as well. I did find these very old taps. Now, one of my subscribers, Hugh Jeffries, was asking about some of these early taps. That's got the original porcelain top in it, whereas unfortunately the other one's been broken out. But I'll probably, if Hugh doesn't want them, I'll probably hang on to those because they are very collectible early taps. They'd be very early 1900s, and they do sell for reasonable money if they're in good condition. So I'll probably keep them for parts. Certainly I'm not going to scrap them for brass because they're nice old genuine antique taps. A few other interesting bits and pieces. This looks like it was a little yacht. There's the sails, but it's been snapped off, and I don't think it's valuable enough to try and fix up, because there'll be a lot of time going into trying to do that and polish it. There's a really old buckle here of some horse harness. Sometimes these are actually made of nickel. This one looks like it'll be brass. So that's all non-ferrous. So what are we going to do next? All right, well, we don't need to test any. Well, I'll show you testing. I'll get the grinder out and we'll test a few things to make sure they are brass. There's a couple, that piece actually may be copper, so we better do a quick test on them all. These bits we're going to make a few decisions on. We've got some very early curtain decorations, or at least the curtain rod, mostly brass, but there's a bit of a steel rivet through the end. I might just try and snap that off. These are early window latches, and the steel parts through them are so rusted that would be quite a extensive job to get the brass out of that. See, there's another metal rivet there. So I'll probably just put that straight in irony brass. There's another one with various metal parts all rusted up. There's an old battery terminal. I think, though, we'll probably just touch that with a grinder and cut that metal bit off, and then we've got a decent chunk of brass. I'm not sure what that's off, but again, the nuts are so rusty, we could probably actually hit them with a hammer and they'll break. So you've got to make decisions on this stuff. You don't want to, you need to know when to quit. You don't want to labour away for 15 minutes to 20 minutes for 5 cents worth of brass. That's got a steel rod right through the top of it. But the rest of the tap appears to be total brass, so we might just cut the rod off really quickly with the grinder. Typical old tap fitting that are all brass. The collar is only holding the hose on. You couldn't put that in clean brass, even though it's only contaminated by rubber and a bit of nylon string. But, you know, one quick cut with the grinder and the collar will come off and it'll be clean. These, I think these were out of the drum heads of a VCR, something like that. Obviously had some sort of copper windings in there. Most of it's brass, so I'm just going to put that straight in the irony brass. We don't have to worry about trying to purify it then. So I'll make a few decisions like that. This piece here, an old tap, I don't think it's worth saving. It's had a piece of steel pipe soldered to it, that end. So yes, a magnet sticks to that end, but not that end, because that end's copper. So we might just break or cut the copper part off, and then the brass tap with the remaining steel can go in the irony brass. So sorting scrap is a whole string of quick decisions, and the quicker you can make them, the better you are. Occasionally you might try and pull something apart that you think will be easy and it turns into be a difficult job. So you just get better at that with experience. Okay, so what are we going to do first? Let's get the grinder going. Okay, we'll go through the pile of clean brass here first and make sure it is brass. I've teared the bucket off on the scales there, so we can now fill the bucket, and then we'll get a weight later on. They can go at my feet. This is a large lump out of a gate valve actually, so that'll be all brass, but let's check. Now, I don't know if it's going to show up yellow on the camera or not. It could even be gunmetal. It's got a bit of a pink look to it, but it's certainly not copper. It's on the yellow side of pink, but sometimes yellow brass is very yellow and sometimes it's a pinkish yellow. But my yard don't take gunmetal separately. Gunmetal has a higher percentage of copper, but my yard will only pay for it as brass. So I'm just going to whip through this. I'll point out anything that's interesting, but basically I'll just double check that it's all brass. Yeah, I think that shows up nice and yellow there. And there we go, that's why we're checking. That piece isn't brass, it's actually a die-cast alloy or a zinc alloy. The actual clamp part of it is brass, but I don't think it's worth trying to get out. So I think we'll put that in irony brass because it pays better than the cast alloy. That piece is brass, but it's got a really big hard rubber wash around it. And there we go, we need to get that off. That piece of heavy plumbing pipe is copper. So I don't know if you can see the colour there, but it's a real bright pink. So definitely copper. And this other piece I had before, definitely copper. This piece looks like a top of a water sprinkler maybe, but the bottom half is a die-cast alloy again, so they can go in irony brass. Okay, now it's time to make some quick decisions with this contaminated stuff here. I'm just going to hit some of these with the grinder, and where I can cut parts off easily I will, as long as I get a decent amount of brass from it. Quick and easy brass. A bit of rubbish, the old hose, and this will just go in with my pressing steel. And again here, just cut off the bigger piece, and we'll leave the contaminated piece in with the irony brass. Now let's have a look at this piece we were discussing earlier. We'll see what these handles are made of. Definitely brass handles. So I've tried to grind through the pivot pin. Let's see if we can get that out okay. I just gave this some wax, and I thought the cast aluminium might break very easily, but no. So I might grind off the bottom, but I suspect this is going to turn into one of the ones that I should have just thrown in the irony aluminium. But sometimes we don't like to be beaten. That's one side out, but we've still got to get the steel pin out of the brass. I think that might hit through okay. Okay, I finally got all this apart. It probably wasn't worth the effort, but it depends on how far you want to go and how much time you got. And some people like to get every microscopic piece of precious metal all separated. I like to kind of make economic decisions, and sometimes I get a bit stubborn, and yeah. Anyway, we got this one cleaned up. So the rest of that I'm just going to take apart basically with spanners and wrenches. It should undo pretty easily. I was going to show you how to free up some of them. We might try it on this one. So I'll show you how to free this up easier rather than just putting all your weight on a spanner that's likely to slip off and cause you an injury. So we'll do that shortly. I know it's not ideal using a vise here that's not attached. Normally I would use my big vise over on the other bench, but there's a couple of reasons why that's not practical at the moment, and one of them is that you guys wouldn't be able to see because it's a bit hard to get over there at the moment. So all right, let's deal with this now, and then I'll undo the rest of them. I do have to cut through this copper of the soldering iron with the grinder. I'm going to do that. And there's another tap I've got to cut through with the grinder, but we're just about finished sorting. I do need to take apart that mixer tap, which I think just pulls apart relatively easy. There's a big nut on the base. We'll have to get the rubber seals out of it. Most of it should be brass. All right, let's go over to the anvil and we'll free this one up before we start undoing it. Okay, I've probably shown you this before, but if you haven't seen my videos, you may not have seen it. It's not overly complicated science, but you will free up threads, especially on water pipe fittings, very easily by just jarring them with a hammer. And you need something really robust. Now, not everyone has an anvil. Some people just use a piece of railway track. You can even use the concrete floor, but you're going to obviously chip it. Bricks don't really work because bricks break up pretty easily. But any decent lump of steel, even out on the ground, if you've got a lump of steel on the ground, it's not going to bounce. If you try to do this on the workbench, you can't jar the fitting enough and it will bounce. Timber benches just don't have enough, well, they've got too much give in them basically. So all I'm going to do here is jar it with a decent hammer on each side, and it frees up the thread really easily, especially if they're rusted. This one looks like it might, oh, there you go. Now, you can't usually undo them with your hands, but you can see rarely brass actually rusts to steel. The steel rusts and it actually grows, and when it grows it gets really tight. But by hammering around it, you free up all the rust, and they normally undo really easily. It's a little bit different with aluminium, because aluminium kind of corrodes or chemically welds itself onto steel, but brass usually doesn't. So this one will be the same. It's actually had some Teflon tape around it, which will help. There's no way known I can undo that with my fingers. I'm probably still going to need a shifter, but I will jar it on all sides first. And pick it up. Now, you don't want to hammer it so much that you flatten one side completely, but you just jar it all the way around, and I should be able to undo that fairly easily with a spanner now. Spanner, shifter, wrench, whatever you use. Let's just see if this will undo like this. Normally I'd put one end in a vise, but this should have freed it up. I don't think my wrench is actually large enough. And it's on the floor again. Yep, that's actually undoing. And I'm fairly confident in suggesting that we would not have been able to undo that just with holding it with these small adjustable wrench. I'm fairly confident to say that if we hadn't have jarred it with the hammer first, we would not have been able to undo that as easily as that. So there we go. Let's clean the rest of them up. We've got everything cleaned up and processed and weighed. I have the trusty notepad ready. First of all, let's look at these things over this side that we're going to keep. I buffed up these taps on the wire wheel. Don't they look amazing? Brass does buff up so easily and it looks great. This one, actually the nickel plating pretty well must have been really thin because most of it buffed off. But the tap works, the actual handle moves. I left that nut on the end. There's easily $10 each in the shop. This one I noticed actually has the initials MMBW, which would be Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works. So that was an official brass tap from the Waterworks department in Melbourne. Anyway, $10 each, no problems in the shop. I could probably nearly go 15, but I'm not going to be greedy. I get plenty of taps. These antique ones I priced at $10 just for parts. In fact, if we put that stem with the nice top on it into that housing, we could make one good tap. Some stainless steel screws that came out of the sink mixer, so they'll just go in a jar of hardware here. So $30 worth of stuff I can sell. As for the rest of the scrap, we have cast aluminium, and my scrapyard will take this die cast stuff as cast aluminium, which is good. The big piece there, I only had to grind one bolt off and the rest of it was all clean. So cast aluminium, we have a little piece of domestic aluminium. That's the piece I actually broke off the big piece. So that goes as irony aluminium. We have some just heavy melt steel. That's all the steel bits I took off the plumbing fittings. Some number 2 copper, 10 kilos of brass there, and another 2.5 kilos on the scale. So 12.5 kilos of clean brass. A few little scrappy bits of metal that'll just go in the shred. One ballast transformer out of a fluorolite. Some irony brass. Now, I need to talk to you about these copper soldering irons. I did try and grind this off and I gave up. I mean, I was lured in by the beautiful coppery colour and thinking that's a lovely chunk of copper. Let's work at this, let's work at this. And you know, the grinder, trying to cut through the soft copper, really bogs it down. It's really hard work. And I still wasn't getting anywhere. I went in both sides and it still wouldn't break out. And I thought, this is ridiculous. It's not worth the effort. So I'm going to lump both those copper soldering iron pieces, complete with the steel rods that they're mounted on, in with the irony brass. We're still getting about $3.50 a kilo. I don't know if they have a category for irony copper, but copper and brass is not a huge difference. So my advice to you guys, if you get these soldering irons, don't be sucked in by the lovely chunk of copper on the end. It's just too much hassle to get off, unless you know an easy way, in which case let me know in the comments underneath. But I've tried them before, and you know, the fact that copper is soft is a bit of a it sort of sucks you in, because it actually makes it harder to grind. Anyway, to the notepad. How much value do you reckon we got out of all this? Well, obviously the brass is the big money spinner. We had $92.50 of brass at, I think the current price I had was $7.40 a kilo. It has been up to $8. $30 worth of saleable items. The irony brass, the heavy melt steel is nearly $1 worth. Number 2 copper, transformer, cast aluminium, everything I've mentioned. We get a total of $133 from one little bucket of stuff that I kept tripping over. It seems like everywhere in my shed, every box, every bucket, every container seems to have at least $100 worth of stuff in it. So I'm looking forward to getting back into my emergency shed. Sometimes we're going to hit the jackpot and go well over that. There we go. Job's done. We can now step a little bit closer to that corner without being tripped over. So thanks for watching, guys. Another adventure in my shed, another unboxing or unbucketing. A bit of scrap content for you scrappers. I actually have a few electronic items, vintage ones, to scrap out soon, so keep an eye out for that. This is something out of my main shed. We're still doing something every week out of the emergency storage shed, and now I've committed to something every week out of the shop storeroom. I've still got to get something out of the carport. So stay tuned. Hope you're enjoying the journey. We've got a few more repair videos coming up as well, so it's all happening. See you next time. Bye for now.